Most people don't realize the moment it begins. There's no breakdown, no warning, just a quiet shift. Things that once felt meaningful start to feel flat, effort feels heavier than it should, motivation doesn't disappear, it goes silent. This isn't a failure of character, it's a biological signal, a nervous system adapting to constant stimulation, instant rewards, and never-ending input. When dopamine is pushed too high for too long, the brain protects itself by pulling back. And what you feel is emptiness, boredom, or emotional numbness. Tonight, we'll unpack the science behind this silent dopamine crash and how to recover what modern life slowly took from you. Most people have been taught to think about dopamine as the brain's feel-good chemical, something you get when you eat great food, scroll social media, or achieve a goal. But that framing is incomplete and misleading. Dopamine is not about pleasure itself. Dopamine is about anticipation, pursuit, and movement towards something. It's the chemical that tells your nervous system, "This matters, pay attention, lean forward, take action." In neuroscience, dopamine functions as a teaching and signaling molecule. It marks what is worth repeating. When dopamine rises before an action, it increases focus, drive, and willingness to expend effort. When it drops too low, everything feels heavy. Not because life suddenly became harder, but because the signal that energizes effort has gone quiet. Here's the critical point. Pleasure and dopamine are not the same thing. Pleasure often occurs after dopamine has done its job. Dopamine gets you moving. Other systems like opioids and endocannabinoids create the sensation of enjoyment. When we confuse dopamine with pleasure, we start chasing feelings instead of respecting signals, and that's where problems begin. In modern life, dopamine is constantly stimulated without effort. Notifications, videos, sugar, novelty, endless information. Each hit gives a small dopamine spike, but without meaningful pursuit. The brain doesn't evolve to handle that. Dopamine systems are designed for scarcity, effort, and delayed reward. When stimulation is constant and easy, the brain adapts by lowering baseline dopamine signaling. This is not punishment, it's protection. That adaptation has consequences. When baseline dopamine drops, motivation feels broken. Tasks that once felt manageable now feel exhausting. You're not lazy, you're not undisciplined, your nervous system is operating with a lower signal-to-noise ratio. The signal that says go is weaker. This is why high dopamine behaviors feel paradoxical. The more you chase stimulation, the less motivated you feel afterward. The crash isn't emotional, it's neurochemical. Dopamine spikes are followed by dips below baseline. Do that repeatedly, and the dips become the new normal. The brain learns that effort is optional and stimulation is guaranteed. Over time, real-world goals lose their pull. Another key misconception: dopamine is not about happiness, it's about direction. You can have high dopamine and still feel anxious or restless. You can have low dopamine and feel numb or indifferent. Dopamine determines whether life feels worth engaging with. Whether you feel pulled toward the future or stuck in place, the most dangerous part of a dopamine imbalance is that it's quiet. There's no alarm, no obvious injury, just a slow erosion of drive. People often describe it as nothing feels worth the effort anymore. That sentence is not a mindset problem. It's a biological state. Understanding dopamine as a signal changes how you approach recovery. You don't fix signaling problems by adding more noise. You fix them by restoring contrast. That means fewer artificial spikes and more effort-linked rewards. Movement-focused work, learning, delayed gratification. Activities where dopamine rises because you showed up, not because you consumed. When dopamine is respected as a signal, not abused as a pleasure shortcut, the brain recalibrates, motivation returns gradually, not explosively. You start to feel capable again, not euphoric, capable, and that's the foundation of sustainable drive. The goal isn't to feel good all the time, the goal is to feel engaged. Dopamine doesn't promise happiness. It offers momentum, and when momentum returns, meaning often follows. The human brain is extraordinarily adaptive. Whatever environment you place it in long enough, it will recalibrate to survive there. This is a strength, but in modern life, it becomes a liability. When stimulation is constant, intense, and effortless, the brain adjusts by lowering its baseline level of motivation. Not because something is wrong, but because something is excessive. Your motivation baseline is the level of drive you feel before anything exciting happens. It's the quiet energy that allows you to start a task, tolerate boredom, and stay engaged when rewards are delayed. In a low-stimulation environment, that baseline stays relatively high. In a high-stimulation environment, the brain protects itself by dialing it down. Every dopamine spike comes with a cost. Neurochemically, what goes up must come down after a surge. Scrolling, gaming, binge, watching, constant novelty. Dopamine drops below baseline. If those spikes happen occasionally, the system recovers. If they happen all day, every day, the baseline itself shifts downward. The brain learns that high stimulation is normal, and everything else feels underwhelming by comparison. This is why ordinary tasks start to feel unusually difficult. Reading a few pages, starting work, having a slow conversation. These activities haven't changed, but your internal reference point has. When the brain is accustomed to rapid dopamine peaks, steady effort feels like deprivation. Motivation doesn't disappear, it becomes relative. Importantly, this has nothing to do with willpower. Willpower is a prefrontal process. Dopamine baseline is a subcortical one. You cannot discipline a chronically overstimulated reward system. You can force yourself for a while, but eventually the system pushes back with fatigue, procrastination, or emotional flatness. Another misconception is that stimulation equals engagement. They are not the same. Stimulation is passive. Engagement is active. One floods the system, the other trains it. When stimulation replaces engagement, the brain stops associating effort with reward. That association is the core of motivation. Over time, constant stimulation fragments attention. Dopamine becomes tied to novelty instead of progress. The nervous system starts craving new rather than meaningful. This is why people jump between apps, tasks, and goals without satisfaction. The brain is chasing spikes, not outcomes. The most subtle damage is emotional. When baseline dopamine is low, life feels dull, not tragic, just colorless. People often describe feeling burnt out, even without extreme stress. That's because burnout isn't always about doing too much. Sometimes it's about being stimulated too much and engaged too little. Restoring the motivation baseline requires reducing the frequency of artificial spikes. Not eliminating pleasure, but reintroducing contrast. Boredom becomes therapeutic here. When you allow periods of low stimulation, the brain begins to recalibrate. Dopamine receptors regain sensitivity. Baseline levels rise. Effort must also come back before reward. This is uncomfortable at first, the brain resists, but this discomfort is a signal of recalibration, not damage. Activities like focused work, physical training, long walks, and learning rebuild the link between effort and dopamine release. Motivation doesn't return as excitement, it returns as capacity, the ability to start, to stay, to finish. When stimulation is no longer constant, the brain remembers how to generate drive internally. And that's when effort stops feeling like suffering and starts feeling meaningful again. The brain's primary job is not to make you happy. It's to keep you stable. When reward signals become too frequent or too intense, the nervous system responds the same way it does to any form of overload, by turning the volume down. This process is called adaptation, and it's one of the most important and misunderstood features of the dopamine system. Dopamine neurons do not fire endlessly at the same intensity. They are designed to respond to change. When something novel, effortful, or meaningful appears, dopamine rises. When that same stimulus becomes constant, the response weakens. This is not failure, it's efficiency. The brain conserves resources by reducing sensitivity to what it sees all the time. In modern environments, high reward stimuli are no longer rare. They are continuous, fast content, intense flavors, constant feedback, instant validation. When the brain is exposed to these inputs repeatedly, dopamine receptors begin to downregulate. In simple terms, they become less responsive. The signal hasn't disappeared, the receiver has changed. This is why people report needing more stimulation to feel the same effect. Louder music, faster content, stronger novelty. What used to feel engaging now feels neutral. What used to feel neutral now feels boring. This is reward numbness, and it develops gradually enough that most people don't notice it happening. The danger is not pleasure itself. The danger is unearned dopamine, reward without effort. When dopamine spikes are detached from work, learning, or challenge, the brain loses its calibration for what's worth pursuing. Effort begins to feel unrewarding not because effort is bad, but because the reward system has been hijacked by easier alternatives. This numbing effect spills into real life. Achievements feel anticlimactic. Progress doesn't register emotionally. Even rest stops feeling restorative. People often interpret this as depression or loss of purpose, when in many cases it's a neurochemical desensitization. Importantly, the brain doesn't distinguish between good and bad sources of dopamine in this context. Whether the spike comes from social media, sugar, or constant multitasking, the adaptation mechanism is the same. High frequency equals reduced sensitivity. The most misleading response is to add more stimulation. More entertainment, more novelty, more intensity. This deepens the problem. Each additional spike pushes baseline sensitivity lower. The system becomes trapped in a loop of chasing feeling and avoiding effort. Recovery works in the opposite direction. Sensitivity returns through withdrawal from excess and reintroduction of effort. When dopamine spikes are reduced, receptors slowly upregulate. When effort precedes reward, the brain relearns what engagement feels like. This process is uncomfortable. Numbness doesn't disappear immediately, it becomes more noticeable at first. That's a sign the system is waking up. Just as muscles ache when they're used again, reward circuits feel flat before they feel alive. Over time, small wins begin to register again. Progress feels satisfying, focus lasts longer, the brain doesn't need extreme input to feel engaged. Reward sensitivity returns not as excitement, but as presence, the ability to feel meaning in ordinary effort. The goal is not to eliminate pleasure, it's to restore proportion. When reward is earned rather than consumed, the brain regains its natural sensitivity. And when sensitivity returns, life doesn't need to be louder to feel meaningful. Boredom is often treated as a personal flaw. Emptiness as a psychological weakness. But from a neurobiological perspective, both are adaptive signals, not character defects. They are the brain's way of communicating that its reward system is out of balance. When dopamine signaling is chronically low or dysregulated, the emotional experience that follows is not sadness, it's flatness. The brain evolved to use discomfort as information. Hunger signals the need for fuel. Fatigue signals the need for rest. In the same way, boredom signals a lack of meaningful engagement relative to the brain's current dopamine baseline. It's not asking for more stimulation, it's asking for relevance and effort. Emptiness emerges when reward prediction fails repeatedly. The brain expects that certain actions, scrolling, watching, consuming, will provide relief or satisfaction. When they don't, the system stops expecting reward altogether. What you experience is not pain, but absence. A quiet detachment from things that once mattered. This state is common in high-stimulation environments. When novelty is constant, nothing feels novel. When rewards are immediate, anticipation disappears. Dopamine thrives on anticipation. Without it, engagement collapses. Life starts to feel like repetition without meaning. Importantly, boredom is not the same as restlessness. Restlessness is excess energy without direction. Boredom is suppressed energy without outlet. In overstimulated brains, the system shuts down rather than revving up. This is why people can feel bored even while constantly occupied. The mistake most people make is interpreting boredom as a cue to escape. They reach for more content, more noise, more distraction. That provides temporary relief but reinforces the underlying imbalance. The brain learns that boredom is something to be avoided, not listened to. From a neural standpoint, boredom is often the first stage of recovery. When artificial stimulation is reduced, dopamine dips below baseline before it rises. During this phase, emptiness becomes noticeable. This is not regression. It's recalibration. The nervous system is adjusting its expectations. Emptiness also has an emotional component tied to meaning. Dopamine doesn't just regulate movement, it regulates purposeful movement. When effort is disconnected from outcomes that matter, the system disengages. The result feels existential, but the root is biological. This is why people report feeling lost even when life appears full. Schedules are packed, inputs are constant, but none of it requires presence, effort, or growth. The brain does not register progress, so it does not release engagement. Reframing boredom changes behavior. Instead of asking, "How do I escape this feeling?" the better question is, "What form of effort would make this feeling resolve?" Often the answer is something slow, difficult, or initially uncomfortable. Reading deeply, training the body. Learning a skill, creating instead of consuming. When effort re-enters the system, dopamine begins to rise in a controlled way. Anticipation returns. The emptiness fades not because life becomes more exciting, but because it becomes participatory again. Boredom and emptiness are not enemies. They are signals that the nervous system is ready for recalibration. When you stop fighting them and start responding with meaningful effort, the brain does what it evolved to do: restore engagement, direction, and quiet motivation. Effort is not just a psychological decision, it's a neurochemical state. When dopamine signaling is balanced, effort feels purposeful. There's resistance, but also momentum. When dopamine is dysregulated, either chronically low or constantly spiked, effort begins to feel unusually heavy. Not challenging, heavy. Dopamine plays a central role in effort valuation. Before you act, the brain runs a calculation. Is this worth the energy cost? Dopamine helps answer that question. When dopamine tone is healthy, the answer is often yes. When it's low, the same task suddenly feels unjustifiable. Nothing about the task has changed. The internal cost, benefit signal has. This is why people describe feeling stuck even when they know what to do. Logic remains intact. Desire does not. You can understand the importance of a goal and still feel unable to move toward it. This is not laziness. Laziness implies choice. What's happening instead is a dampened neural signal for effort initiation. In overstimulated systems, dopamine is repeatedly driven high and then allowed to crash. Over time, the brain learns that high reward can be accessed without sustained effort. When real effort is required, work, learning, discipline, the system resists. It's not rebellion, it's conditioning. Another layer of this problem is stress. Chronic stress and high cortisol further suppress dopamine signaling in key motivation circuits. This creates a loop. Low dopamine makes effort feel harder, which increases stress, which lowers dopamine even more. People interpret this as burnout, but at its core, it's a neurochemical bottleneck. The brain also associates effort with delayed reward. If most rewards in your environment are immediate, the brain becomes less tolerant of delay. Effort-heavy tasks feel not just hard, but pointless. The future stops pulling you forward. Importantly, forcing effort through willpower alone can backfire. The prefrontal cortex can override motivation temporarily, but it cannot sustain drive without dopamine support. This is why people experience bursts of discipline followed by crashes. The system is being overridden, not retrained. Restoring the relationship between effort and dopamine requires repairing effort with reward. That means reducing easy dopamine sources and allowing effort-based dopamine to matter again. This doesn't require extreme deprivation. It requires consistency and restraint. Physical effort is one of the fastest ways to begin this repair. Movement increases dopamine receptor sensitivity and creates clean effort-linked reward. Cognitive effort, deep work, learning follows a similar pattern but requires patience. The reward comes later, and that delay is part of the therapy. Early in recovery, effort feels harder before it feels easier. This is a sign the system is recalibrating, dopamine levels are stabilizing, and the brain is relearning how to assign value. Quitting at this stage reinforces the belief that effort is futile. Over time, something shifts. Effort stops feeling oppressive. It still requires energy, but it no longer feels emotionally expensive. You regain the ability to start without drama, to continue without constant resistance. Effort is not meant to feel effortless, it's meant to feel worth it. When dopamine signaling is restored, effort regains its dignity. And with that, motivation becomes reliable, not because life is easier, but because your brain is once again aligned with purposeful action. When motivation collapses, the instinct is to search for something new, a new routine, a new supplement, a new source of inspiration. But from a neurobiological perspective, recovery from dopamine dysregulation rarely begins with addition. It begins with subtraction. The nervous system doesn't need more input, it needs space to recalibrate. Dopamine systems are sensitive to contrast. They respond not to absolute pleasure, but to changes in stimulation. When everything is intense, nothing stands out. When everything is rewarding, nothing feels earned. Excess flattens the signal, removing excess restores it. This is why breaks from constant stimulation feel uncomfortable at first. When artificial dopamine spikes are reduced, dopamine levels temporarily dip below baseline, the brain protests. Boredom, restlessness, irritability, these are not signs of damage. They are signs of withdrawal from excess. The system is relearning what normal feels like. One of the most powerful recovery tools is limiting high-frequency dopamine behaviors. This doesn't mean eliminating joy or living ascetically. It means reducing activities that provide rapid reward without effort, endless scrolling, constant snacking, background entertainment. These behaviors train the brain to expect stimulation on demand. Silence is another underestimated intervention. Quiet environments reduce sensory load and allow dopamine tone to stabilize. The brain evolved with long periods of low input. When those periods disappear, recovery stalls. Even short daily windows of silence can have outsized effects. Sleep plays a critical role here. Dopamine receptors reset during deep sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation mimics dopamine deficiency. You can't out-hack a sleep-deprived brain. Recovery requires protecting sleep as a non-negotiable biological process, not a lifestyle option. After excess is reduced, effort must be reintroduced carefully, not all at once. Small, consistent challenges rebuild confidence in the effort-reward relationship. The goal is not intensity, it's reliability. The brain needs to relearn that showing up leads somewhere. Cold exposure, exercise, and focused work increase dopamine in a slow, sustained way. Unlike artificial spikes, these increases don't crash below baseline. They train the system rather than exhaust it. Over time, baseline dopamine rises not dramatically, but meaningfully. Importantly, recovery is nonlinear. Some days motivation returns, other days it disappears. This variability is normal. Dopamine systems recalibrate gradually. Expecting constant progress creates frustration and stress, which undermines the process. The most difficult shift is psychological. Modern culture equates progress with accumulation, more information, more stimulation, more optimization, but biological recovery often looks like less, fewer inputs, fewer distractions, fewer false rewards. When excess is removed, the brain regains its sensitivity. Ordinary experiences start to register again. A conversation feels engaging, a task feels doable, progress feels satisfying, not euphoric, stable. The goal of recovery is not peak performance, it's baseline functionality, a nervous system that can tolerate boredom, initiate effort, and sustain focus. From that foundation, growth becomes possible again. You don't recover motivation by chasing it. You recover it by creating the conditions where it can return on its own. Remove what overwhelms the system, respect the brain's need for contrast, and allow time to do the rest. The silence isn't empty, it's where recalibration begins.